Hello, everyone, and thanks for being here tonight. So each year, the graduate students, we've been on pause for a little time for COVID, but each year graduate students organize a lecture, a public lecture, and invite a scholar from outside the university to give a talk. And this year we're happy to have Professor Áine O'Healy as our guest speaker. So I first came across her work while I was writing a paper on Marco Ferreri's Storia di Piera, which is a film from 1980, around there. And so not only she is one of the few people who actually wrote about this film back in 1994, but I also found the essay, which is titled Filming Female Autobiography, Maraini, Ferrari, and Piera's Own Story, a particularly thought-provoking and insightful essay. I thought it would be great then to invite her here to share with us her most recent work. I want to thank her for kindly accepting my invitation. So before handing over to Professor O'Healy, I'm going to briefly introduce her and today's talk. So also forgive me if I mispronounce any name. So Áine O'Healy is a professor of modern languages and literatures at Loyola Marymount University, where she teaches Italian literature, Italian cultural studies, and transnational film studies. Her current research interests lie in contemporary European cinemas, migration studies, gender and sexuality studies, and most recently, documentary studies. Her most recent book is Migrant Anxieties, Italian Cinema in a Transnational Frame, which came out in 2019. In 2011, she co-edited Transnational Feminism in Film and Media with Serena Moscardelli and Enrico Masi. She is also co-editor of a special issue of Feminist Media Studies titled Transcultural Mediations and Transnational Politics of Difference, and a special issue of California Italian Studies titled Moving Images from 2017. She has additionally published a book on Cesare Pavese and has translated several scholarly books, including In Spite of Plato by Adriana Cavarero. She has written about 70 articles and book chapters, most recently narrating the transnational trajectories and transgender performances of the Sworn Virgin, co-authored with Caterina Romeo for The Italianist, which came out in 2022, and Anti-Gypsyism, Intergenerational Conflict and Intersectional Dilemmas for the Journal of Postcolonial Writing. For today's lecture, Professor O'Healy will give an overview of different modalities of non-fiction filmmaking emerged in Italy in the last decade in response to a changing demographic landscape and increasing economic disparity. She will focus on two specific case studies, the 2019 documentary Shelter, directed by Enrico Masi, and the documentary Il mio corpo by Michele Pennetta, which came out in 2020. And she will explore how the audibility and visibility of refugees, migrants, and other precarious subjects are negotiated and performed on screen. Okay.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. And I'm very pleased to be here this evening. Thank you all for coming. As Lily Ciuriacchi, Pierluigi Musarò, and other scholars in Europe have argued, media reporting on refugees and migrants has routinely reinforced the framework of crisis constructed by European political interests by repeatedly relaying spectacles of mass arrivals, imperilment, or urgent intervention. These dramatic scenarios serve to elicit alternating responses of fear, anxiety, hostility, and compassion, affects that may occlude the larger political questions and structural violence underpinning contemporary migrations. Though European filmmakers have generally aimed at providing more nuanced narratives about irregular arrivals from the global south than those found in mainstream media, they do not always attain a more complex affective engagement with contemporary mobilities than those afforded by mainstream media. Unsurprisingly, given its position at the southern edge of Europe's Mediterranean shore, where hundreds of thousands of irregular seaborne migrants have disembarked over the past 25 years, Italy has produced an expansive body of audiovisual texts featuring irregular maritime border crossings. Much critical work has already been done on the fictional scenarios of migration produced in Italian feature films, but considerably less attention has been paid to Italian documentaries dealing with this and related issues. Yet in the wider field of film studies in recent years, scholars have shown increasing interest in the non-fiction form. The debates emerging in this broader scholarly context have prompted me to raise similar questions about the documentary production in Italy at present. Some of the pertinent issues raised here are: what credibility do documentary productions retain in the global present? How can we tell fiction from nonfiction in an age of pervasive reality spectacles? How can the conventional documentary form be decolonized? And what are the ethical issues associated with documenting precarious lives? Now, I'm not going to answer these questions at this point in my project, which is still at the very early stages, but I want to acknowledge them as the springboard for the most recent direction in my research. I must also acknowledge some of the critiques leveled against the documentary form, some of which are not at all new, which I similarly bear in mind as I approach the specific nonfiction films that have recently drawn my attention. And some of these are the critiques leveled against the contemporary documentary, that it provides contrived engagement with unfamiliar life worlds. It makes distorted truth claims. It promotes self-congratulatory empathy or armchair humanitarianism, and that it exploits its on-screen subjects and audiences in overt or imperceptible ways. Prompted by the urgencies of the global present, there has been a remarkable proliferation of nonfiction filmmaking in Italy over the past 15 years, which has been facilitated by evolving audiovisual technologies, as well as by the emergence of flexible production and distribution practices. Regarding the Italian context, Anita Angelone and Clarissa Clough have noted that documentary film has resurged as one of the most innovative and creative artistic sites in Italy, challenging established forms and subject matters and proposing new and unprecedented visions of both Italy and Italians, often extending beyond geographic borders, close quote. The documentaries produced during the last 15 years have, in fact, increasingly centered on phenomena associated with the migrations from the global south and on the frictions accompanying the demographic shifts that have occurred in Italy as a result. Created by Italians as well as non-Italian filmmakers, these productions span a range of formats: video art installations, expository documentaries made for television, collaborative projects made with the participation of immigrants, shorts and full-length films produced by military and other actors involved in the management of migration, hybrid documentaries incorporating recycled archival footage and/or various forms of reenactment, and experimental or poetic short films. This variety immediately reveals how broad a range of modalities the documentary can encompass. At the outset, this wave of activity had a predominantly activist tonality and aimed at raising political consciousness, most prominently exemplified in the documentaries created by Andrea Segre and his various collaborators in an explicit attempt to raise public awareness of Italy's commitment to inhumane migration policies, its covert involvement in funding the creation of migrant detention centers in Libya, and its collusion in maritime pushback operations that violated basic human rights. What distinguished Segre's work from similarly inspired projects was the consistent participation of immigrants and refugees who recounted the horrors they had witnessed in the course of their journeys, exposing, through their personal stories, the necropolitical dimensions of the EU border regime. In one of Segre's projects, the gripping documentary Come un uomo sulla terra, Like a Man on Earth, made in 2008, the Ethiopian migrant Dagmawi Mer, himself a survivor of the Sahara crossing and the Libyan detention system, is credited as co-director, and he has subsequently gone on to make several documentaries independently of Segre, films that are similarly marked by a spirit of solidarity and resistance to racism in all its forms. In October 2013, 2 major shipwrecks occurred within the vicinity of Lampedusa, resulting in the total death toll of about 600 people and bringing to broad public awareness the scale of the human tragedy occurring at Europe's southern borders. This enormous loss of life prompted the Italian government to initiate a large search and rescue program operated by the Italian Navy, known as Mare Nostrum. It remained active for just a year before it was replaced by the Triton operation, an EU initiative of narrower scope. The October shipwrecks also inspired the making of more than a handful of noteworthy documentaries addressed to different audiences, with different aesthetic objectives and with different affective results. The films produced in this context, and I'm giving the list here, include, among others, Dagmawi Mer's poetic short Asmat, Nomi delle vittime nel mare, a dirge to the lives lost on October 3rd, combining live action sequences of shrouded figures in the sea, watercolor sketches of human figures above and below the water, and the animated inscription of the names of the dead on the dark surface of the Mediterranean. The soundtrack includes not only the recitations of the names of the drowned, but also a song, as well as a spoken denunciation of the neo-colonial world order that drives such people to their death. The following year saw the release of Gianfranco Rosi's widely circulated and critically successful Fuoco a Mare, Fire at Sea, shot on Lampedusa over a period of 18 months, which features parallel stories of daily life on the island on the one hand, and the patrol and rescue operations performed routinely in the surrounding waters on the other. Although the film has been criticized for its lack of direct interaction with the migrants and refugees regularly intercepted and brought to shore, in other words, for its failure to engage with them as people endowed with agency, Rosi's awareness of the limits of his own access to these subjects at any level other than through the distancing mechanism of the lens or the screen is inscribed in the very texture of the film itself. And I'm giving a couple of examples here. The first time we see migrants in that film, the face is occluded by sort of plastic barrier. And again, when the good Dr. Bartolo is discussing his experience, he's the only Italian with the direct interaction with the migrants. He does so using another screen. So, in other words, the encounter with the migrants in this film is never personal. It's never a personal encounter, but the film does draw attention to its very inability to foreground any sense of agency or subjectivity for the migrants. In contrast to Rosi's poetic and quietly observational presentation of selected aspects of life on Lampedusa, the rather conventionally articulated HBO documentary It Will Be Chaos, created by New York-based filmmakers Lorena Luciano and Filippo Piscopo, takes a more dramatically engaging approach to the spectacle of life and death in and around the same island. Its chaotic opening sequence, featuring Giusy Nicolini, mayor of Lampedusa, other official figures, journalists, clergy, and mourners, implicitly provides one of the strongest condemnations of the European border regime ever committed to film. The remainder of the film, however, takes some distance from the embedded political potential of the opening sequence in order to attend to the emotional suffering of selected survivors proceeding arduously to Northern Europe to escape the violent circumstances prevailing in their homelands in Eritrea and Syria, respectively. And this is one of the characters in the film that the filmmakers follow, Aragai Mehari from Eritrea, who actually draws attention in recounting his experience to the treatment of the migrant survivors as less than human. He's describing how, when he was being processed in Italy, he was treated like a dog, basically, and eventually he did escape this situation and moved in a clandestine path to Sweden, where he now resides and has achieved legal status. Okay. The very different modalities adopted by these documentaries, or contrasting modalities, I should say, though both inspired by the enormous loss of life on Mediterranean shores, draw attention to the function of affect in the contemporary nonfiction film. Affect as a social, pre-personal, and pre-subjective dimension, along with the personal experiential states we describe as emotions, is inevitably implicated in the cinematic experience. In theorizing the cultural and political impact of audiovisual texts, several scholars have argued that eliciting affect is at the heart of cinema. And I'm referring here to the works of particularly Sarah Ahmed and Laura Marks. And much theoretical work has already been dedicated to the workings of affect in cinematic fiction. Although less attention has been paid to the affective capacities of the documentary, the critical voice of filmmaker and scholar Jill Godmilow has been clear on this score. Denouncing the deployment of empathy-seeking strategies commonly used in the nonfiction film, Godmilow claims that the function of the documentary filmmaker is to make viewers see something they've never seen before and to understand something new, without resorting to gratuitous identification and catharsis. A process that, according to Godmilow, short-circuits the need for self-questioning or even awareness of one's position in a world of asymmetrical power relations. Excuse me. In other words, compassion-producing identification can enable viewers to feel good about themselves for recognizing the imagined humanity of others, but it scarcely compels them to consider their own responsibility for social change. Io sto con la sposa, directed by Italian filmmaker Antonio Agugliaro, Italian journalist Gabriele Del Grande, and Palestinian poet Khaled Soliman al-Nasiri, provides a compelling counterpoint to the films I've just discussed by virtue of its complex deployment of affect. Though the film was similarly made in the wake of the calamitous events of October 2013, the deadly sea crossings emerge in the course of this narrative as fragments of traumatic memory, recounted along with other traumatic memories of violence witnessed in the participants' troubled homelands. Traversing a geographical path that stretches from Milan to Stockholm, the film evokes Europe's borderscape as a complex web of experiences, both hindering and enabling the passage of those seeking shelter and security. The making of Io sto con la sposa was prompted by a chance encounter in late October 2013 at a Milan train station between Gabriele Del Grande and Abdallah Salam, a Palestinian-Syrian survivor of the second October shipwreck. Learning that Abdallah wanted to travel to Sweden to claim asylum, Del Grande decided to help him and hatched a plan to make it happen. Less than 2 weeks later, he had assembled a total of 5 Palestinian and Syrian refugees, including Abdallah, who were determined to seek refuge in Sweden. In mid-November, the 5 of them set out from Milan, disguised as members of a wedding party, because, as one of them says, nobody would ever stop a bride on her way to her wedding. Having agreed that the journey could be filmed, they were accompanied by Agugliaro, Del Grande, Khaled Soliman al-Nasiri, who had just received his Italian passport, and Tasnim Fared, a Palestinian Syrian activist with a German passport who had agreed to pose as the bride, as well as a dozen additional sympathizers, activists, and the video crew. On the border separating Italy and France between Ventimiglia and Menton, there is a concealed mountain path popularly known as Il Passo della Morte, which has been used for more than a century by individuals seeking to cross into France while avoiding the scrutiny of border guards. Although internal border checks between continental EU nations were abolished in the 90s thanks to the Schengen Agreement, these were reintroduced in 2015 following terrorist activity within Europe. Refugees and displaced people now seeking to leave Italy and enter France are thus likely to be pushed back at the border by the authorities and denied their right to asylum. Since, according to the Dublin regulation, asylum must be sought at the first point of entry into Europe. In the past 10 years, thousands of people lacking the necessary travel documents have embarked on this risky concealed pathway, the Il Passo della Morte, to cross into France without detection, some falling to their death in the process. The 5 Syrian and Palestinian refugees disguised as a bridal party made their way across this risky terrain, accompanied by the film crew and supporters on November 14th, 2013. 2013. One of the most remarkable images from the ensuing film is a shot of the presumed bride, resplendent in white satin, brocade, and lace, preparing to cross through the gap in the barbed wire fence that marks the international border on the mountainside. After entering France safely, the group reassembled in a convoy of cars, one of these adorned with a satin bridal rosette, those big things they put on the cars in Italy when there's a wedding, and headed for Sweden. Their disguise was successful, or perhaps they were merely lucky. As the smartly attired travelers progressed through France, Luxembourg, Germany, and Denmark without incident, arriving in Stockholm after 4 intense days on the road, interspersed with convivial evenings at hospitable safe houses along the way. At the conclusion of this journey, the filmmakers financed post-production via a hugely successful crowdfunding campaign conducted on social media, raising $100,000 in a matter of weeks, 100,000 euro. The project concluded with the release of On the Bride's Side in 2014, which was screened at festivals, including the 2015 Venice Film Festival, and distributed in commercial cinemas in Italy with considerable and critical and commercial success. But what exactly is this film? Documentary, docudrama, docufiction, or simply a defiant record of civil disobedience, which is what the participants, or at least Del Grande, imagined it to be. Clearly, the journey constructed in the film actually took place, though the travelers, while on the road, are performing a fiction specifically devised to enable 5 of them to complete the journey without incident. The stakes are high not only for the 5 refugees, but also for their European fellow travelers, as they risked a prison sentence of up to 15 years if charged with people smuggling. Imparting this knowledge to the viewer at the outset of the film sets up a certain dramatic tension, but also an investment in the success of the escapade. Over the course of the film, the travelers consistently inhabit their assigned roles while moving in the public eye. Yet at other private moments, they reveal to their companions and to those who offer shelter in safe houses the horrific experience that they have already endured. One of the most emotionally resonant scenes in the film is comprised of Salam recounting his near-death experience to his fellow travelers as they set off on their common journey. He tells them, and indirectly the film viewers, the story of his survival on a vessel where many others died, that is, the shipwreck of October the 11th, in Maltese waters not far from Lampedusa. He relates how the rescue crew, lifting him from the sinking vessel and presuming him to be dead, threw him onto the deck of the rescue ship along with several lifeless bodies. As additional corpses were piled up on top of him, he felt he would die of suffocation, but finally managed with great difficulty to alert the crew to his undead state. Abdallah Salem's account evokes, in an uncanny way, the necro-political dimensions of European immigration control, which is enacted against people grasping at the possibility of an existence that is more than merely death in life. It also resonates with Judith Butler's description of the violence of the border as a violence against those who are already not quite living, that is, living in a state of suspension between life and death. Abdallah's words have a powerful affective impact, not unlike the impact generated by the testimony of the Ethiopian survivors of the Libyan detention centers in Come un uomo sulla terra, or by the testimony of the Eritrean Aragai Mehari in It Will Be Chaos. In Io sto con la sposa, however, the affect elicited by Abdallah's words contrasts with many other affective resonances enabled by the film, including some suspense, humor, and even jubilation, creating a complex web of competing emotions. The purportedly private moments in which the participants share their traumatic memories and aspirations for the future with each other are not, of course, private, as they were shot and edited for a film destined for public consumption, presumably with the participants' prior agreement. As critical viewers, however, we are prompted to ask, what effects does this on-screen exposure portend for the precarious subjects at the heart of the filmmaker's well-intentioned project? To what extent are the traveler's revelations prompted by the intervention of the filmmakers? Is their future safety put at risk by their on-screen performances? Does the film adequately acknowledge the disparities of power between those who conceptualize the journey and those legally precarious, economically challenged, existentially imperiled travelers who agreed to reveal their names, faces, and stories on screen? Is the project marked by traces of conventional white saviorism, a stubborn trope that insinuates itself into all too many European films about contemporary migrations from the global south? In other words, for what audience is this film ultimately made? These concerns, rather than traditional questions regarding authenticity or inauthenticity, truth or distortion provoked by the documentary form, are symptomatic responses to many of the nonfiction films currently emerging about precarious, marginalized, or otherwise abjected subjects at present. More recent documentary film production in Italy has distanced itself from the recounting of trauma to the more everyday stories of survival at the edges of contemporary capitalist society. Two recent documentaries by Italian filmmakers, Enrico Masi Shelter, Farewell to Eden, released in 2019, and Michele Pennetta's Il mio corpo, released in 2020, take a new look at the complexities of migrant and other precarious lives, reflecting obliquely on the relation between bodies and landscapes, between human and non-human forms of life. While the first of these films subverts conventional documentary expectations with its disjunctive visual track and aporetic narrative development, the second presents itself as a hyper-realist account of the parallel existences of two socially isolated young people, one a Nigerian immigrant and the other a pre-adolescent Sicilian boy, living at a short distance from each other in central Sicily. The stylistic opposition between the two films, Shelter and Il mio corpo, is particularly striking, since the subject of both of them is what Zygmunt Bauman has memorably described as wasted lives, denoting the growing number of human beings relegated to the margins of society for whom capitalism has no use: refugees, the homeless, slum dwellers, and similarly abjected figures. Deprived of a sense of hope for the future, they exist without any capital other than the bodies they inhabit. The bodies of such marginalized or racialized subjects provide the visual focus of both Masi's and Pennetta's films, but they are constructed very differently by the respective filmmakers. In Shelter, the body in question is the visually elusive figure of Pepsi, an undocumented, trans-feminine Filipina migrant who makes her way from Italy to France in search of asylum and eventual employment as a caregiver. And there she is on the left, and one of the protagonists of Corpo, Il mio corpo, is on the right. Careful never to show her face, the film follows her journey in a fragmented way from Italy to France through a process of reenactment. Often the location, so it was shot over 3 years in Sardinia, Bologna, Liguria, the Maritime Alps, and Paris. And Pepsi's voiceover, which was recorded before the film was made, guides the narrative. Okay. Pepsi tells the viewers in voiceover that this is not her real name, but rather one of several that she uses to avoid identification and detention. Careful never to show her face, the film follows her journey in a fragmented way from Italy to France through a process of reenactment. I've said that already. Often the location of scenes showing on the visual track is unacknowledged, and in some instances the sites appearing on screen are at odds with the voiceover commentary. For example, here, she's talking about working in Libya, and what we're looking at is this snowy European winter. At several junctures, the protagonist remains silent and unseen for substantial intervals of time as the visual track occupies itself with the landscape, with the animals, or with groups of Black African migrants. So I'll give you some shots of the film. There's Pepsi, presumably at the asylum processing center in Bologna. But as I said, most of these scenes are reenacted, so the actual settings are contrived. But she always appears with her face covered or away from the camera. Okay. And this is the same Passo della Morte between Ventimiglia and Menton that appears in with the Io sto con la sposa, because Pepsi too took this journey into France. The final sequence, however, is explicitly identified by an off-screen tour guide as taking place in the Jaurès district of Paris, where dozens of migrant tents are crowding the banks of the Canal Saint-Martin, thus becoming objects of the tourist gaze. In one of these tents, we are led to presume, lives Pepsi, who by now has been lucky enough to find some irregular work providing massages. In the course of her journey, Pepsi narrates in halting English the life trajectory that brought her to Italy. At the age of 10, she was recruited by the Moro Islamic Liberation Front in the mountains of Mindanao, where she later gained some rudimentary experience as a medic. Eventually compelled to flee the harshness of military life, she traded stolen weapons for sufficient cash to move overseas. Having settled in Gaddafi's Libya, she worked, happily she reports, as a nurse for 10 years in an environment that needed and appreciated her skills, until the rise of Islamic radicalism in the wake of Gaddafi's death, which prompted her to sail to Europe. Though she had successfully begun her process of asylum in Italy, she abandons it with the intention of pursuing refugee status in England, which she assumed would be more hospitable to her needs. Despite her feminine self-presentation, her skills as a former fighter stand her in good stead. Among other feats, she succeeds in negotiating a loan, the infamous Passo della Morte, and enters into France unseen by guards. But she is not invincible, she reports the abuse she encountered along the way as the result of her distinctive appearance and embodiment, including being gang raped by 6 men at the so-called Calais jungle, the point from which she had planned to cross to England before giving up on this plan. The film's narrative has many gaps and ellipses, and the protagonist is sometimes entirely absent from the scene. Several sequences are focused on the movements of African migrants who sleep under bridges, gather in groups to warm their hands over a quickly assembled wood fire, eat and move on. The common thread that appears to bind these migrants is Islam, punctuating their days with the demand for communal prayer. Pepsi, by contrast, is not a practicing Muslim. No, here we are. And we also hear on the soundtrack the call for prayer in Paris, which seems to dominate all of the sounds. She notes that homosexuality is forbidden by Islamic law, and she acknowledges her outsider status in the culture to which she was born. Politically aware, Pepsi inserts into her account a denunciation of the colonial adventures of the West, blaming the distress witnessed in today's Europe, including the incursion of millions of unwanted migrants, as the fallout of historical abuses. Pepsi's voiceover narration of the personal hardships endured over the course of her journey, including the brutal rape, is juxtaposed on the visual track with archival images, possibly taken with a cell phone, of a young girl frolicking happily on a beach, another girl playing in the waves, and a woman sailing on a yacht at sunset. These images are presumably intended as a projection of Pepsi's dreams of her possible future, but it's unclear if they originate in specific information communicated to the filmmaker by his subject, or if they are solely attributable to Masi's imagination. Here and elsewhere, one has the sense that Pepsi's attempt to communicate her subjective experience and self-understanding may be eclipsed by the filmmaker's desire to voice his own assumptions about who she is. In the film's final moments, Pepsi's voice emerges with greater confidence and purpose than in previous scenes. Living in Paris for some time, she seems to have found some peace and is working, perhaps temporarily, as a masseuse. Traveling by boat on one of the city's canals, she makes a definitive statement of self-love and self-acceptance, acknowledging that she is merely a small atom of the world, and describing herself as gay, Muslim, rebel, nurse, and refugee. She declares that she loves all elements that constitute her identity and asserts her right to be exactly who she is. And I think I can actually play this.
The world will not complete without Pepsi. Right? Even I am the small atoms of this world. Because I'm here. So I am the ingredient of the world.
Nous devons dire que ces soldats, à l'époque, on des groupes, mais pour le faire discrètement. Pour le faire discrètement, il faut le faire rapidement. Et en rentrant dans des quartiers, qu'est-ce qu'ils faisaient? Ils s'exclamaient fameusement alcool, c'était évidemment pour dire alcool, et puis que ça saute, on parlait vite, bien sûr. Et donc, évidemment, monsieur c'est lui le discours. Et qui d'ailleurs, l'administration de Paris, nul n'a besoin d'être français pour être parisien. À l'image, justement, du bistrot ou encore chez les chefs publics de notre humble serviteur qui est néerlandais des Pays-Bas. Voilà. Et je sais la tête que tous les Parisiens dans le métro, par contre, vous verrez, je suis bien parisien, ça y a aucun. So, of course, as we are right now leaving the 19th arrondissement of Paris, passing through what the modern world does as well, but that's a different story. Meanwhile, I hope that they will be fine. But anyways, more importantly here, we left the 19th arrondissement, that was known as the area of Jaurès.
Gay Muslim. rebels, nurse, refugee. All of that, I love it. I have to stand it because it is my right.
Okay. So as you see, the insertion of that footage of the tents constructed or raised around the banks of the canal are poised to receive her message about herself too, because of all these other people that we don't see and to which the tour guide wishes well are obviously also atoms of the world that have their own claim to dignity and self-assertion. While such statements are perhaps intended to infuse the film's concluding moments with a sense of hope, the legal and economic precarity that still threatens the protagonist's very survival is simply ignored. The film ends with a peculiar note of sentimentality, that is, with the inscription of a patriotic Filipino poem on the visual track, nostalgically invoking the beautiful faraway landscape that is Pepsi's lost homeland. Sorry, no, I don't have it here anymore. Nostalgically invoking the beautiful faraway landscape that is Pepsi's lost homeland, the Eden of the film's subtitle, and the film's subtitle refers to this Eden. In a recent study of contemporary documentary, Pooja Rangan argues that abjected or dehumanized life not only sustains the documentary, but supplies its raison d'etre. She claims that this is particularly the case for participatory documentary, whose guiding humanitarian ethic, that is, giving voice to the other, or sometimes even giving the camera to the other, invents the very disenfranchised humanity that it claims to redeem. Despite Shelter's insistence on having Pepsi recount her own story and voice over, the sentimental logic of its concluding sequence, which undermines the dominant tonality of Pepsi's self-construction throughout most of the film, betrays an implicit attempt to redeem and refashion the perceived otherness of its queer Asian protagonist, according to the vision of the filmmaker and his projected Western audience. Aesthetically, at the opposite pole from Shelter, Michele Pennetta's Il mio corpo, this is the epigraph that ends the story of Pepsi. Farewell, beloved homeland, region beyond beloved by the sun, pearl of all eastern seas, our lost Eden. Okay, so aesthetically the opposite of Shelter, Pennetta's Il mio corpo is a visually striking film shot in lush cinemascope by Paolo Ferrari and featuring a striking sound design. Apart from one sequence at the beach, it unfolds entirely in the internal part of the province of Caltanissetta in central Sicily, a parched terrain marked by irregular dumping sites, abandoned sulfur mines, and grazing sheep. Yet, shot in majestic widescreen format, the landscape has an arresting beauty reminiscent of the allure of the Western. Adopting the observational mode, the film follows the everyday unfolding of two separate existences. That of Oscar, the adolescent son of a local scrap dealer, who spends his days with his father and older brother salvaging metal objects from illegal dump sites around the province. And Stanley, a Nigerian youth with a short-term residency permit, who ekes out a meager living at various jobs, including cleaning a church, harvesting grapes, and herding sheep on the plateau. The film initially introduces us to Oscar, then punctuates his story with scenes from Stanley's life. Neither figure is aware of the other, though they inhabit the same general territory. Oscar has been abandoned by his mother and is physically and verbally abused by his father, Marco. In fact, he once testified in court to his father's violent behavior, which led to a brief jail sentence, as the father himself resentfully mentions in a scene in the film. Both of Marco's sons, Oscar and the slightly older Roberto, do the hard work of identifying and extracting pertinent waste, mostly household appliances, from the ravines into which they've been tossed, as the father waits on the viaduct above them to hoist up the spoils with a makeshift pulley. The days are hot and dry, and the work is backbreaking. By evening, they have gathered a large collection of objects of comparatively little exchange value. In an interview, Pennetta revealed that he perceives Oscar as a 21st century version of Rosso Malpelo, the brutish child laborer in the Sicilian sulfur mines who appears in Giovanni Verga's late 19th century eponymous story. A character condemned to die as he had lived, never emerging from his slightly less than human state. Oscar, however, the real-life contemporary Sicilian who inhabits the same mining territory as Verga's characters, now abandoned to post-industrial decay, is apparently frozen in a similarly abjected state, and is thus, at least for Pennetta, one of the vinti, or defeated, of our time. Despite the filmmaker's declared equivalence, the film captures moments in which Oscar manages temporarily to escape the tyranny of his father's rule, taking off to explore the countryside on his bicycle or resting quietly in the fields. Sorry, I'm going the wrong direction. So there's his reprieve. Stanley's days are also predominantly focused on work, mopping the church floor, harvesting grapes, herding the sheep. Though diligent, efficient, and religiously devout, he struggles to pay the rent, is eventually evicted, and moves into a small, dilapidated trailer. Stanley's Nigerian friend Blessed taunts him for not leaving the region and seeking out better things. But Stanley is stuck, apparently unable to trust the possibility of a less arduous and unrewarding life. Blessed, unlike Stanley, is without legal status in Italy and is waiting anxiously for the result of his application for asylum. Their conversation reveals that they have both fled violent situations in Nigeria. Despite occasional tensions between the pair, the companionship offered by Blessed enables Stanley to enjoy moments of pleasure, including a day at the beach and an evening dancing at a social center frequented by other African migrants. When Blessed suddenly disappears from the scene after his application for asylum is rejected, Stanley seems momentarily devastated. But like Oscar, he mostly maintains a stoic facade. Moving swiftly from one form of labor to another, he finally gets work as a shepherd and is assigned a makeshift sleeping space in a derelict building in order to keep watch over the animals at night. One evening, as darkness falls, Oscar appears to accidentally stumble upon this isolated spot and enters Stanley's space. In this, their only encounter in the film, no words are exchanged between them. In the final shot of the sequence, which is the final scene in the film, the penultimate scene of the film, Oscar is lying asleep on Stanley's rudimentary bed, while Stanley sits by the doorway until he too falls asleep. Unlike the rest of the film, which adheres rigorously to the observational mode, the encounter between Oscar and Stanley is obviously contrived, underlying its rhetorical function, which implicitly invites the viewer to consider the circumstances that both youths are obliged to endure, with little hope for change, or even, as their silence suggests, for solidarity. In the next and final scene of the film, Oscar, his father, and brother are again heading home after a day's work, their van laden with its harvest of waste metal, driving away from the camera and into the gathering darkness. The film's title, Il mio corpo, has obvious biopolitical implications. But this phrase is additionally weighted with connotations of the sacred, as the filmmaker has indicated on a number of occasions, noting that the phrase, "this is my body," is central to the Christian liturgy. Oscar has no obvious connection with religion, but in an early scene at the dump site, he discovers with some enthusiasm a large discarded statue of the Madonna, and delivers it to his father via the usual pulley system, whereupon the Virgin Mary appears briefly to fly upwards in the air ascending into the heavens of recycled waste. Stanley has a more mundane connection to religious practice as he cleans a church in exchange for food, and he recites a short prayer before he eats his meals. On the first occasion in which he is seen sweeping the floor in the elegantly decorated church, a brief fragment of Pergolesi's Stabat Mater is heard in the background, presumably emerging from the organ loft above the camera lens. Since there is little music in the film, the sudden eruption of sacred organ music at this juncture has an unsettling effect. Later, in the film's final scene, where Oscar's family is driving home in darkness, the Stabat Mater is reintroduced extra-diegetically this time, in the only instance of non-diegetic music in the entire film. When Pergolesi's Baroque arrangement of the Stabat Mater is introduced here, it is accompanied by the Latin text of the eponymous medieval poem, which is sung by a choir of children's voices. Since the respective mothers of Oscar and Stanley have long ago abandoned their sons, as we learn at earlier moments in their respective stories, the scene evoked by these words, the image of a mother who suffers as she stands watching her suffering son, has perhaps some intended irony, but it also hints at redemptive grace. Such grace is neither requested nor received by any of the on-screen figures, but it is available to the film's viewers searching for a hint of transcendence in the film's bleak life world. One is inevitably reminded of Pasolini's use of Baroque music in Accattone and Mamma Roma, where the sonorous majesty of the soundtrack offers a sharp counterpoint to the squalor of the settings constructed on screen. But these films are not documentaries where such contrapuntal aesthetic references seem less likely to occur. Comparing the ending of Il mio corpo with the concluding sequence of Shelter, Farewell to Eden, however, one may recognize a comparable aestheticizing gesture, as the final moments of Masi's film are devoted to a nostalgic evocation of the lost Eden of the Philippines through the text of the 19th century poet. The aesthetic aspirations of this citation are heightened on the visual track with images of the rocky landscape of Sardinia intended by the filmmaker to evoke the beauty of Pepsi's island of birth. So in both films, art is invoked to elevate the precarious lives at the center of our attention, artificially folding them into aesthetic traditions and aspirations that these socially abjected protagonists are unlikely to recognize, much less inhabit. And that's it. Thank you.